in the blood-soaked aftermath of the Battle of Crimson Sands, where the kingdom's forces had fought for 3 desperate days and nights against the overwhelming eastern invasion that threatened to destroy everything they had built over 6 centuries. General Kiran lay dying on the scorched battlefield among thousands of fallen soldiers, both friend and enemy. His solar lion mark, which had blazed brilliantly through 20 years of distinguished military service, leading countless campaigns and protecting the kingdom's vulnerable borders from those who would exploit any weakness. He had fought magnificently and sacrificially until the very end, his body broken by wounds too numerous and severe to survive, his mark preparing to release him as he died and returned to the Solar Lion to seek a new worthy bearer. As consciousness slipped away, and he surrendered to the inevitable death he had earned through his final act of service, he felt unexpected warmth press against his chest where his mark flickered its last fading light. A woman had found him among the countless fallen, someone he had never met, items and occasionally for survivors among the thousands of dead and dying who covered the blood-soaked sand. Her name was Elara, and when she touched his solar lion mark, trying to assess his injuries and determine if he could possibly be saved or was already too far gone, something completely impossible and unprecedented happened. The mark, which should have been releasing him as he died and returning to divine source to find new bearer, instead flared brilliant as the sun itself and locked onto her hand with irresistible force, refusing to let her pull away, pouring its concentrated remaining power not just through the dying general but into her living body as well, creating circuit of divine energy flowing between them. The mark that had chosen him 20 years ago was now choosing her as well, but it was not releasing him to make room for her. Instead, it was binding them together permanently, 2 separate souls now sharing one impossibly divided mark, suddenly sustained and even restored by the Scavenger's vitality and energy flowing through their newly forged and completely unprecedented connection. He did not die that day, despite wounds that absolutely should have killed him, and she could not leave him or even move more than a few feet away without experiencing agonizing pain. The mark held them together with unbreakable bond, refused to release either one of them, creating connection that no one had witnessed or recorded in centuries of carefully documented history. Already you've checked if you're subscribed to the channel? And tell me, from which city are you listening to this story? A disciplined civilization built on military excellence and divine favor, granted through the Solar Lion's selective marks to its greatest and most worthy warriors and strategic leaders. The kingdom's defensive power and its very survival rested primarily on its marked generals, often outnumbered them 2 or 3 to 1, and sometimes more. General Kiran had been among the most distinguished and decorated of these divinely marked leaders, battalion from certain annihilation when they were surrounded and cut off from reinforcements. The mark had served him faithfully and powerfully for 20 full years after that defining moment, significantly enhancing his already considerable physical capabilities, granting him strategic and tactical insights that sometimes bordered on supernatural precognition, impossible feats of endurance and sustained strength over days without rest or proper food. He had risen through the military ranks with remarkable speed, his combination of marked supernatural abilities and genuine. By age 45, Kiran commanded the kingdom's entire Western army. He was deeply respected by the soldiers under his command, genuinely feared by enemies who had learned through painful experience to avoid direct confrontation with his forces, and highly valued by the Sun King, who relied on him completely to maintain security and stability in volatile. Kiran had dedicated his entire adult life utterly and completely to military service, consciously sacrificing personal relationships and ordinary comforts for duty and honor. Who could not protect themselves from the violence that constantly threatened their lives and communities? He had never married, had no children, meant living alone and dying alone in service to something larger than himself. He had made peace with this sacrifice, viewing it as necessary cost of being worthy of divine selection and the power it granted. The Battle of Crimson Sands began when massive Eastern invasion force, significantly larger and far better equipped than any previous threat the kingdom had faced in living memory. Military intelligence had completely substantial reinforcements that would take at least 3 or 4 days to properly mobilize and deploy to the threatened border regions. He made the agonizing but strategically necessary decision to fight costly holding action, specifically designed to slow the invasion's advance, enough for civilian populations to evacuate from the path of destruction, and for reinforcements to organize and establish proper defensive line further west that could actually stop the invasion rather than just delaying it. For 3 full days and equally long nights, his forces fought with desperate courage born from understanding that every hour they held meant thousands of civilians survived who would otherwise be killed or enslaved by the advancing enemy. Kiran was everywhere during those 3 nightmarish days, his solar lion mark blazing continuously as he personally led critical charges, rallied broken and retreating units back into formation, and personally held essential positions when defensive lines threatened to collapse completely under overwhelming pressure. He did not sleep at all, barely ate even when food was available, pushed his marked body to its absolute limits, and then far beyond those limits. Kiran recognized with his strategic genius that victory was actually achievable if they could just hold their position long enough for the reinforcements that were finally approaching from the west. The enemy invasion force, overextended from 3 days of constant fighting and exhausted from their own heavy casualties, was increasingly vulnerable to one final devastating shock charge that could break their momentum entirely and force them to retreat in disarray rather than continuing their advance. But successfully leading such a charge would be almost certainly suicidal for whoever went first and absorbed the initial devastating counterattack, creating the opening that others could then exploit to shatter enemy cohesion. All-or-nothing gambit that would either save the kingdom completely or die gloriously trying. They charged directly into the enemy center formation with marks blazing and weapons raised. Of the 50 marked warriors who charged with him into the enemy center, only 12 survived even the initial minutes of intense and brutal close combat. Kiran himself took multiple wounds that would have killed any unmarked person instantly and completely. He kept fighting desperately, because stopping meant dying immediately, and dying meant the charge would fail and everyone's sacrifices would be wasted, pushing his mark far beyond any reasonable or safe limits, essentially burning through his own life force to maintain the supernatural strength needed to lead his surviving warriors forward through the enemy ranks until they finally broke and began fleeing in panic and disarray. When the enemy finally shattered completely and began retreating in full disorganized rout. When hard-won victory was finally secured and reinforcements arrived to pursue the fleeing invasion force and ensure they could not regroup, dramatically as the divine power that had sustained him through utterly impossible circumstances finally released its emergency hold on his failing body. He collapsed heavily among the countless dead and dying that covered the blood-soaked ground, his numerous and severe wounds catching up with him all at once in overwhelming wave, massive blood loss and accumulated trauma finally overcoming even his marked resilience and supernatural endurance. His surviving officers tried desperately and frantically to save him, but Kiran knew with absolute certainty that he was dying, could actually feel his life force draining steadily away, like water through broken dam. He had given everything to Solaria his entire adult life. Every relationship he might have had, every moment of peace or comfort, and now he would give his death as well, accepting it as natural and even fitting conclusion to a life spent entirely in service and sacrifice. He closed his eyes slowly, consciously letting go of life, surrendering peacefully to the inevitable death with a soldier's long-practiced calm acceptance of mortality as the final duty. Then he felt unexpected warmth press firmly against his chest, exactly where his mark blazed its final fading light, felt gentle hands touch him carefully, heard an unfamiliar woman's voice asking urgently if anyone could hear her, if he was still alive enough to possibly be saved by immediate intervention. Elara was 32 years old, completely unmarked by any divine power. She was what soldiers and officers dismissively called a battlefield scavenger, one of those desperate people who moved carefully through horrific carnage after the fighting finally ended, looking systematically for anything valuable that could be sold or traded for food and shelter, when such help would not cost her too much or put her at excessive risk. It was grim and morally questionable work that most people with better options considered deeply dishonorable or even ghoulish, but it was reliable survival in a harsh world that offered her very few viable alternatives given her complete lack of education, skills, or family connections. She had been born in one of the many poor border villages that existed in constant uncertainty and intermittent terror, too dangerously close to the violent eastern wastes to be truly safe, but too poor and isolated to realistically relocate to the more secure interior territories where most citizens lived. Her parents had been subsistence farmers working extremely marginal land. She had grown up knowing hunger and fear as constant companions, killing her parents and most of the people she had known her entire life. She had survived only by hiding and running, and in the immediate aftermath she had discovered through desperate necessity that battlefield dead often carried, and that wounded soldiers would sometimes offer payment for water or basic medical assistance that required no special training, and that she could survive by providing these grim services when literally no one else would bother. Over 7 hard years she had developed grimly efficient routine, arriving at battle sites shortly after the fighting concluded, but before official recovery operations could begin, noticed her presence and chased her away as unworthy scavenger, supposedly desecrating sacred ground where heroes had fallen defending the kingdom. She had arrived at Crimson Sands late on the evening after the final battle concluded. She moved through the horrific carnage methodically and quickly, checking bodies with practiced efficiency born from years of grim experience, taking weapons and armor and coins that could be sold to merchants who asked no questions, offering water to conscious wounded soldiers who could pay for it with whatever they had, without excessive risk or cost to her own survival. She was working systematically through a section of the battlefield where marked warriors had apparently made their final desperate charge, where the concentration of bodies was thickest and the fighting had clearly been most intense and brutal. She recognized him immediately from descriptions and his widely known reputation, knew this was the legendary marked general who had defended the kingdom successfully for 20 years, whose final suicidal charge had apparently saved everyone by breaking the invasion force's cohesion and momentum. She also recognized immediately that he was actively dying, his numerous wounds far too severe for anything she could realistically do to help meaningfully with her limited knowledge and non-existent resources. She should have simply moved on without stopping, leaving him to die with whatever dignity remained after such a brutal battle, focusing her limited time and energy on finding valuables among less prominent casualties. But something made her pause despite the practical reasons to keep moving, made her kneel beside him in his blood, made her reach out to touch his solar lion mark that flickered weakly on his chest, the divine symbol struggling desperately to maintain its presence as its bearer's life drained away. She just wanted to see the mark closely before it faded completely and returned to divine source, to witness the precise moment when a mark released its dying bearer, the precise moment her bare hand made direct contact with the location of his mark beneath the blood-soaked armor. Everything changed in ways she could never have anticipated or prepared for, even if she had somehow known what was coming. The mark, which had been flickering weakly and fading steadily as Kiran died, suddenly blazed brilliantly and intensely, as if someone had poured oil on a dying fire. But she discovered immediately that she could not pull back or release contact, no matter how hard she tried. The mark held her hand firmly in place, as if she had pressed it against the strongest magnet in existence, divine power flowing through the point of contact with absolutely overwhelming force that felt like touching living lightning. She felt the power surge violently up her arm and spread throughout her entire body in burning waves, warmth and strength, and the intense sensation of being filled with pure concentrated sunlight that was impossibly intense, but which somehow, at the same time, she felt something flowing in the opposite direction, whose catastrophic wounds began healing with impossible speed as divine power amplified, dramatically by her living presence, worked frantically to repair damage that should have been completely irreparable, even for marked warriors. His collapsed lung re-inflated fully, his punctured organs sealed themselves perfectly, his massive blood loss somehow reversed completely as his body regenerated what had been lost. And beneath her trapped hand she could feel the mark changing and expanding, spreading across his chest in new intricate patterns, while simultaneously creating matching patterns on her own chest, golden light clearly visible through her clothing, symbols that mirrored his mark but were distinctly and uniquely her own. The bond that was forming was not one mark choosing between two potential bearers as normally happened, but rather one mark claiming both of them simultaneously and permanently, binding them together in an unprecedented connection that absolutely refused to allow any separation or release. When the overwhelming light finally faded enough for sight to return, When the explosive surge of power settled somewhat into steady, intense flow rather than overwhelming torrent, Elara found herself still kneeling beside Kiran with her hand pressed firmly to his chest, completely unable to pull away no matter how desperately she tried. And Kiran was staring up at her with an expression of complete shock and utter confusion, very much alive and conscious, despite injuries that absolutely should have killed him minutes ago. "What did you do?" he gasped, his voice rough and severely strained, but surprisingly functional despite. "What is happening to us? Why can I feel you as if you were literally part of me, as if we are sharing the same body?" Panic rising sharply as she realized she was somehow trapped by divine power far beyond her control or understanding. "I just touched your mark because I wanted to see it closely before it faded completely, and returned to the solar lion. I did not mean to do anything except witness a sacred moment that I would never see again. I do not understand any of this or what it means. The mark was clearly releasing you, choosing to let you die and find a new worthy bearer. But now it is somehow holding both of us, and I can feel your life force and my own mixing together through this connection, and I am terrified." The surviving officers and exhausted healers who had been working frantically to save General Kiran were now staring at Elara with expressions ranging from profound shock to deep suspicion to outright hostility was occurring right in front of them. One of the healers, an older woman marked by the fire caracal with decades of experience treating battle wounds, approached very cautiously and carefully examined the visible connection between Kiran and Elara, her expression growing increasingly disturbed and confused as she assessed the unprecedented situation with all her knowledge and experience. "This should not be possible," the healer muttered, speaking more to herself than to anyone else. "Marks do not bind two separate people together like this. They choose one bearer carefully, occasionally transfer to another if the first bearer dies or somehow becomes unworthy. Physical connections between two separate individuals who should remain distinct. Yet that is clearly exactly what is happening here, in defiance of everything we know. His mark is somehow sustaining both of them now simultaneously, his severe wounds healing impossibly fast through divine power that is being dramatically amplified by her living presence. A senior officer, a marked warrior whose own Night Panther symbol glowed prominently on his muscular arm, knelt beside them and spoke with the authority born from decades of military service and command. "Can either of you release each other voluntarily? Can you break this connection through conscious effort or willpower?" Both Kiran and Elara tried immediately, concentrating intensely on separating, on breaking whatever invisible bond held them together, but absolutely nothing happened except a noticeable intensification of the connection as their focused attention somehow strengthened rather than weakened what joined them so completely. "We are stuck," Elara said, fear very evident in her voice now, as the full implications of their situation began registering in her mind. "This mark absolutely will not let me go, will not release my hand, and I can feel General Kiran's presence inside, my mind and body, as if we are somehow sharing the same existence rather than being two separate people. I am just a battlefield scavenger, unmarked and completely unworthy of any divine attention. Understands. What happens to me now? What happens to both of us?" The senior officer said very carefully, clearly uncertain himself about proper protocol for this unprecedented situation. For now, you will both remain here under guard while we determine what this means and what should be done about it. Do not attempt to leave or to forcibly break the connection." Her hand still pressed to his chest, the mark glowing steadily and powerfully between them. They discovered quickly that they could not move more than about 10 feet apart before experiencing excruciating pain that drove them to their knees, gasping. Could not break the physical contact for more than a few seconds before the pain became absolutely unbearable. Elara could sense Kiran's lingering pain from his still healing wounds, his profound confusion and disorientation about being alive when he absolutely should be dead, his growing concern and worry about what this binding meant for his continued military service and his entire identity as a marked general. Kiran could sense Elara's intense fear and bone-deep exhaustion, terror that this inexplicable binding would somehow destroy both of them. They began talking quietly to each other as hours passed, trying desperately to understand each other and their shared predicament, building a fragile connection beyond just the mark that bound them together physically. "I am sorry," Elara said at one point, her voice heavy with genuine guilt and worry. "I did not mean to do this to you. I was just scavenging like always, looking for things that would help me survive another week or month. I saw you dying, and I wanted to witness something sacred, wanted to see the mark's release. I never imagined touching it would create this binding or trap us together or steal your deserved death from you after you had earned rest through an entire lifetime of faithful service." "You did not steal my death," Kiran said firmly, his voice growing noticeably stronger as his wounds continued healing rapidly through their shared connection. "You prevented it, whether intentionally or not. I was ready to die, had made complete peace with it as the natural conclusion to a life spent entirely in service. But the mark chose differently. It chose to bind us together rather than releasing either of us, and that choice was not yours or mine, but the Solar Lion's divine will. Whatever this means, whatever consequences follow from it, they are manifestations of divine will rather than our failure or mistake. We will have to navigate this together now, figure out what it means and how to live with it, because we apparently have absolutely no choice except to remain bound until we understand the purpose of this connection." As night fell completely and they remained locked together on the battlefield, as exhaustion finally overcame their fear and confusion, allowing them to sleep in awkward kneeling position, with her hand still pressed to his chest, that the general who fell and the scavenger whose touch he could not escape would ultimately prove that destiny sometimes deliberately chose the most unexpected partnerships for purposes that would only become clear through years of time and shared struggle and eventual understanding, drove them to their knees, gasping and sometimes screaming. Conservative priests argued passionately that the binding was a dangerous aberration that should be broken through whatever means proved necessary, a divine mistake or some kind of corruption that needed immediate correction before it could spread or negatively influence other marks throughout the kingdom. But scholarly priests who took time to examine ancient texts found scattered references to similar bindings in the kingdom's earliest half-forgotten histories. The Solar Lion did not explain to mortals, but which apparently served specific and important divine purposes that transcended human understanding. These unprecedented bonds were extraordinarily rare, perhaps occurring only once every 200 or 300 years across all the territories, But they were not completely unprecedented or inherently wrong, despite being deeply unusual and disruptive to normal expectations. The Sun King himself ultimately decided after days of debate that Kiran and Elara would remain bound while scholars and priests studied the phenomenon more thoroughly, potentially damage both of them permanently or anger the solar lion whose will had clearly created this connection, regardless of how unexpected or inconvenient it might be for everyone involved. Kiran was allowed to gradually return to his duties as general once his wounds healed completely, though his authority and effectiveness were significantly diminished by constant questions about whether he could possibly command effectively while permanently accompanied by an unmarked, common scavenger woman who knew nothing about military operations or strategy. Elara had no official role or position in the military or broader society, existing in a strange, uncomfortable limbo as neither servant nor marked one, neither soldier nor civilian, accompanying Kiran everywhere because the mark gave them. Beyond being an unwilling anchor trapped in a connection neither of them had chosen or wanted initially. The first 6 months were brutally difficult for both of them as they struggled to learn how to live with a binding that allowed absolutely no privacy or independence whatsoever. That forced them to remain in constant close proximity and to feel each other's emotions and even physical sensations through a connection that deepened and intensified rather than weakening over time, as they both desperately hoped it would. Kiran struggled intensely with the sudden loss of autonomy he had always taken completely for granted throughout his adult life, with his absolute inability to be alone even for a few minutes or to make any decisions about his own body and location without necessarily considering Elara's needs and significant limitations. He struggled with deep resentment that his mark, which had served him so faithfully for 20 years, and he struggled with profound shame about resenting Elara when she had done absolutely nothing wrong, when she was suffering far more than he was from a binding that had violently torn her from her. Elara struggled constantly with feeling completely worthless and burdensome, certain she was actively destroying Kiran's distinguished life and hard-earned reputation through her mere presence. She struggled with the mark's intense power flowing through her continuously. Divine energy her untrained body and mind were not remotely prepared to handle or channel effectively, leaving her constantly exhausted and frequently sick until she very gradually adapted to the overwhelming sensations, the way she could always feel his emotions, and sometimes even his surface thoughts, the complete lack of privacy or normal boundaries that would have allowed her to maintain any separate identity rather than being absorbed completely into his life and existence. But slowly and painfully over many months, they began to adapt and find practical ways. Kiran gradually discovered that Elara's constant presence actually enhanced his marked abilities rather than diminishing them, as he had initially feared, that the power flowing through their shared connection was noticeably stronger and more easily controllable than what he had accessed working alone for 20 years. Elara gradually discovered that she could sense certain things through the mark that Kiran somehow could not despite his training and experience, that her completely different perspective and life experiences gave her occasional valuable insights into complex situations that his intensive military training had not prepared him to recognize or interpret correctly. They learned to communicate effectively through the bond itself when normal words were impossible or insufficient. and they began truly talking to each other honestly during the many long hours when close proximity was required anyway, sharing their very different histories and perspectives, gradually building genuine understanding and even friendship rather than just barely tolerating their forced coexistence. Kiran learned about Elara's childhood poverty in the border regions and her village's complete destruction, about 7 years of grim scavenging and constant survival struggles that had taught her to be remarkably resourceful and carefully observant in ways that complemented his formal tactical training. Elara learned about Kiran's deep dedication to service and his chosen isolation from normal human connections. They discovered unexpected compatibility beneath the forced binding. They might have actually chosen each other's company. 1 year after the binding, during a difficult campaign against renewed and organized border raids, Kiran was leading a reconnaissance mission into disputed territory when his entire force was suddenly ambushed by enemy forces that had somehow evaded all their scouts and established a perfect, deadly trap. Kiran's considerable tactical skills told him immediately they needed to retreat urgently or be completely slaughtered. But Elara suddenly sensed something through their bond that he had completely missed. But the mark was practically screaming at her that retreating in that particular direction meant certain death. "Trust me, please," she said urgently, grabbing his arm desperately. "Do not go that way. I know it looks completely safe, but it is absolutely not. There is serious danger there, another ambush waiting on the retreat path. I can feel it through the mark even though I cannot see anything or explain how I know." Kiran trusted her instinct immediately, despite having no confirmation, altered his retreat plan instantly to use a different route, and discovered later that enemy forces had indeed positioned a second ambush exactly where Elara had sensed danger. The successful mission, achieved specifically because Elara's bond-enhanced perceptions had somehow detected what conventional scouting had completely missed, began gradually shifting how Kiran's officers and soldiers viewed her constant presence among them. She was not just an unwilling burden forced on their general by divine mistake. Over the following 2 years, as they worked together intensively and learned to consciously use their unprecedented binding as a genuine advantage, rather than just enduring it as a mutual curse they were stuck with, physical connection forcing them together constantly. They discovered through daily experience that they trusted each other completely with their lives and deepest secrets, rather than the prison sentence it had initially felt like for both of them. The military campaigns they participated in together during this period tested and proved their partnership repeatedly. There was the siege of Fort Sandstone, where Elara's intuitive sense of the enemy's hidden tunnel network, something she felt through the mark but could not logically explain, allowed them to prevent a surprise attack that would have been devastating. There was the winter campaign, where their ability to communicate silently through their bond allowed them to coordinate complex tactical maneuvers that would have been impossible with normal battlefield communication methods. Each success built their confidence in the binding and in each other. There was the battle where Elara's inexperience with combat situations caused her to panic at a critical moment. The guilt she felt was crushing, but Kiran refused to blame her, instead working with her to develop techniques for managing fear and keeping their emotions from overwhelming each other during high-stress situations. There was the political meeting where Kiran's habitual military directness offended a crucial ally, discovering that being bound together did not automatically create compatibility, or erase the normal frictions that arose between any two people sharing space and life. But through all these challenges, their fundamental commitment to making the partnership work never wavered, because they both understood that they had no alternative except to find ways to function together effectively and even happily. They also faced ongoing external challenges from people who viewed their binding with suspicion or hostility. Conservative marked ones argued that Elara's presence was corrupting Kiran's mark, that allowing an unmarked scavenger to share divine power was blasphemous and dangerous. Some claimed to see evidence that Kiran's abilities were declining or changing in problematic ways. Others worried about succession and tradition, questioning what would happen when Kiran eventually died. Would the mark release then? Or would Elara retain some of it? Would their children, if they had any, inherit a mark? These questions had no clear answers, which made people uncomfortable and suspicious. Elara faced particular hostility from marked ones who viewed her as an interloper, someone who had not earned divine attention through courage or service, but had stumbled into it through accident. She dealt with daily microaggressions and occasional open hostility, pretending to be equals of marked warriors. Kiran defended her consistently and publicly, making clear that anyone who disrespected Elara would answer to him personally. But his protection could not prevent all the subtle ways people made her feel unwelcome and lesser. She developed thick skin and learned to ignore most of it, rather than on the opinions of people who had decided to judge her without knowing her. The most profound test of their partnership came 2.5 years after the binding, when Kiran was offered command of the entire kingdom's military forces, the highest position a marked general could achieve. It was recognition of his tactical genius and decades of service, the culmination of everything he had worked toward his entire adult life. But accepting the position meant relocating to the capital permanently, taking on administrative and political responsibilities that would limit his time in the field, and most critically, the decision was technically his alone, as the one being offered the position, but the binding meant it affected both of them equally. They discussed it intensely for days, weighing the opportunities against the costs, considering what they both wanted versus what duty demanded. He deserved, and fearing she would fail him completely in situations requiring social graces and political awareness she utterly lacked. In the end, they decided together that Kiran would accept the position. The court was far more rigidly hierarchical and conscious of status than the military camps they were used to. Nobles who would never dream of openly challenging, clear through exclusion and subtle insults that cut deeply precisely because they could not be. She attended formal events and felt people's stares and whispers knew they were discussing her inadequate manners and inappropriate presence, and struggled constantly with feeling like she was failing Kiran by not being the polished, noble partner he deserved. But she also discovered unexpected strengths in this new environment. Her outsider perspective allowed her to see court politics with clarity that lifelong insiders lacked, recognizing manipulations and hidden agendas that Kiran might have missed. Her years of survival by reading people and situations made her surprisingly effective at navigating social dynamics once she understood the basic rules and patterns. And her genuine lack of personal ambition or political agenda made her trustworthy in ways that nobles constantly jockeying for position and advantage could never be, beyond genuinely trying to help. He was brilliant in military strategy and tactics, but peacetime military leadership required different skills he had never needed to develop budget negotiations, diplomatic relations with allied kingdoms, managing competing priorities, and limited resources. She helped him navigate the political complexities, warned him when he was about to offend someone important without realizing it, and offered perspective on how his decisions affected ordinary citizens rather than just military effectiveness. Their bond allowed them to work together so seamlessly that people who initially viewed Elara as liability gradually came to recognize her as an invaluable asset, someone whose partnership with Kiran made him more effective rather than less, someone whose unusual position and perspective allowed her to contribute in ways that traditionally trained nobles could not. And they fell deeply in love, gradually and almost unconsciously, through all these shared struggles and victories and daily intimacies of life lived in constant connection. The love grew not from dramatic moments, but from countless small ones. The way he befriended her when she was attacked, the way she supported him through frustrations he could share with no one else, the way they learned to laugh together at absurdities of court life, the way they found comfort in each other's presence, even in their darkest and most difficult moments. 3 years after the binding that had saved his life and changed both of them forever, when they finally acknowledged their feelings and what they meant, the mark bound us together without our choice or consent, forcing a connection neither of us wanted initially. But I want to choose you now, deliberately and freely. Will you marry me, Elara? Will you let me choose what fate forced upon us, making our binding into a genuine partnership based on love rather than just divine obligation we must endure? With gratitude for his patience through all the difficult months and his willingness to see her value, when everyone else saw only burden. Yes, she said. Yes, to choosing what we could not choose before, to making this bond into a real marriage based on genuine love rather than just divine binding we were stuck with. Yes, because you have shown me that falling as a general does not mean staying fallen forever. If this story moved you, if you recognize that sometimes divine power binds us to people we would never choose but desperately need, if you understand that refusing to release can be the greatest blessing disguised as curse, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation that became your salvation? Have you ever been bound to someone who transformed your understanding of yourself? Subscribe to Solaris Legends for more tales of marks that refuse to release, of generals who fall only to rise differently, of scavengers who become irreplaceable through bonds forged in crisis and desperation. Their wedding 6 months later was attended by thousands, a public declaration that their binding was not merely divine accident, but genuine partnership worthy of celebration. When they exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to continue choosing each other daily, despite the mark that gave them no choice. The Solar Lion's presence was felt by everyone present, divine approval washing over the gathering like warm sunlight. And when Kiran's mark blazed bright at the moment they sealed their marriage, spreading its light to encompass Elara as well. Until next time, may you recognize that bindings can become blessings. May you find those who refuse to release you even when you think you want freedom. May you discover that what seems like trap might actually be salvation you needed without knowing it. This is Solaris Legends, where generals fall and rise again differently.